Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Bethany, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Hello, my name is Bethanee Bemis, and I am a museum specialist at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History.
Now, how'd you get interested in this area? Because Disney is a fascinating subject, but you have the Mirror Mirror exhibit we got to talk about. There's so much we're going to be talking about in this episode. I'm just excited to talk with you.
Yeah, so my specialty is actually in political history. That's the department that I work in at the museum. And we were putting up an exhibit that was about American democracy. And it asked the question, who gets to tell American stories? Do we all need to know the same stories to sort of have a common culture? And how do we decide what those stories are? And when we were putting it together, I just kept thinking, well, it's Disney, right? That tells American stories. And that really started my academic investigation into Disney. But before that, I'd been going since I was a kid, and I was really familiar with the movies. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, it's the Disney animation renaissance, and so we're all familiar with the characters. So um, I've been sort of studying it all of my life, but really only academically for about 5 years.
Now, can you take me to the beginning? Like, what's your best example of Disney teaching maybe American history?
Hmm. Disney starts out as a company basing their cartoons on American folktales, which is part of why I think they become imbued with this sense of being a very American company from the time that they start. So even the very first Mickey Mouse cartoon that comes out, Steamboat Willie, it's based on a Buster Keaton film, Steamboat Bill, which everyone at the time would have known. Um, it was very popular at the time. It uses the folk tune Turkey in the Straw, which people in America would have been singing for ages. And it glorifies sort of the American heartland. And that's the thread that Disney has pulled through, I think, all of their sort of um, historically based films and attractions in their parks, is that their niche is sort of glorifying the common man, the everyman, which is part, I think, of why Americans identify with them so much.
Kind of like the underdog stories as well, too, that everyone loves.
Absolutely. Mickey, in most of his early cartoon films, Mickey's like the ultimate underdog. He's always fighting someone bigger than him and stronger than him. And that during the Great Depression really uh, increased his popularity, right? Because people were really looking for that sense of, we can fight this big sort of black dog of depression that's clouded over the country, if only we have a little pluck, right?
Now, when it comes to different generations, though, like compared to like the Great Depression era compared to where we have now, do we still have that same underdog story? I mean, I noticed it with like, I mean, my only example would be Cars, where you have, I mean, but he's on the top and then he falls down and then he has to work his way back up to get back to where he was before. But do we have that underdog story still, or is it more about like self-conflict? It seems like more modern day problems, like the Disney films have really, I've noticed, have evolved with the times. And maybe that was like that back then, but there's a lot of things that we are more aware of now that the Disney films really try and represent, which I think is good on them.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think that it's sort of both, right? So you still have characters like Moana that are sort of fighting powers that are larger than them. But then I also think in films like Encanto, they really dove into sort of inter-family conflict, right? And that sort of psychological work that I think people of newer generations are doing, like you said, to sort of look inside and say, what in my life do I need to grapple with to become a better person? So I think you're spot on. Yeah.
Now, were you aware that they had such an impact, like through your research and through like just, I mean, being an enjoyment of the Disney parks and Disney movies and everything Disney? Did you realize that they had that much of an impact at the beginning compared to where you landed with your research?
Yeah, I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find anyone on the street who hasn't heard of Disney, right? They have almost 100% worldwide name brand recognition, which is incredible for any company. And so I think even if you like, if whether you like or don't like Disney, you are aware of it, which gives it extraordinary power in itself. Um, And then when I sort of dove into the research, I've seen studies that estimate that somewhere between 83 and 90% of Americans will visit a Disney park at some point in their lifetime. I know you had said earlier that you hadn't been since you were 4, but you've been, right? So you're part of that statistic of having been at least once in your lifetime. And in the US, there are not very many experiences that we share in common anymore. It's a very vast country. It comes with people of a lot of different backgrounds. We all have different sort of rituals and religions, and all of that is fantastic. And what we don't have anymore is a sort of like town square gathering place, right? If you think about early Americans, they're celebrating national holidays all together in one common experience, and that's part of what unites them under their identity as being American. And for me, I think that this Disney experience, again, no matter what you think of it after you have it, is one of the few experiences that Americans are sharing in common, and that's part of what unites us under one identity.
Now, is the Disney experience just for the parks, or is it something like, because you mentioned the park rather than like a movie? Like, if you look at the statistics, number of people that have seen a Disney movie, it doesn't even need to be from like in the past 20 years. You just do in the past year alone, your numbers are probably going to be higher than someone that visited a park because it seems like Disney's involved in like every movie that at least I watch. Um, but is that still part of the Disney experience, or do you mean like something about going somewhere, much like a lot of people went to church or went somewhere where there was a group of people that were just kind of there for the experience and really to be in the wholesome moment around a community. And Disney does do that. That's one thing I really give them praise for is the fact that they've somehow isolated you from the real problems or political stuff. I mean, despite whatever goes on recently now with the political stuff, but it really makes you feel like that experience doesn't touch and it's all about the imagination.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I haven't studied as much of the films. I think that there is sort of a ritual again to having shared knowledge and shared experience of that film and that story. Much like we pass down stories from American history, Paul Revere, Paul Bunyan, all of those guys. Um, Disney is sort of passing on these folk heroes, right? That tell us who we should be and what kind of values we should be espousing. Um, I do think, though, there is something to that physical sort of shared experience that happens across time at the Disney parks. And like you said, it becomes a very heightened and almost religious experience, particularly if you're in a large group, right? And it's an experience that's meant to sort of capture all of your emotions and create that in you. And when you share that with other people, it is like if everyone went to the same church and had that sort of transcendent experience.
I mean, it's got to be some type of trance because the amount of people that wait in these lines for that long of a time, I'm like, I don't know how you guys do it. I would go nuts. After a 5 minute wait, I'd be done.
It's really worth it to people, and there are a lot of different theories about why that is. I think it's different for everyone, but I think that a lot of people feel like their best self when they're at Disney, in the sense that, like you said, they're isolated from the problems of the outside world. It's a space that feels safe physically and psychologically and emotionally. And so being able to let go of those concerns, even if it's only for 8 hours or however long you're in the park, that's a really great dopamine rush that I think people continue to chase.
Now, it's not just for kids, though. Like a lot of people think of amusement parks as being like for kids and maybe young adolescents, but I've seen honestly more adults go there than I've seen kids.
Absolutely. I mean, the older you get, the more the pressures of life need a pressure valve, right? And people can criticize whether they think that it's childish for adults to go there, but I think everyone can relate to the experience of needing uh, needing to sort of turn off that part of your brain, right? That's dealing with paying the bills and going to work tomorrow and the political atmosphere that's happening outside of the gates. And whether that comes with, sitting in your basement and playing a video game, or whether that comes with going to a football game on Sunday, or whether it comes with going to a Disney park. Everyone's always chasing that feeling.
Now, when did the Disney parks officially start? Like when it started coming from more than just the Mickey Mouse cartoons and that, when did it officially become an actual place where people can go and be able to experience it?
Disneyland in California opens in 1955. And then Walt Disney World in Florida opens in 1971.
Okay, so that's actually not that long of a time if you really think about the parks.
Disney World just sort of had, well, just sort of, they just had their 50th anniversary, um, which feels like a long time and no time at all, right? I mean, it's long enough that your parents and grandparents, remember it opening, um, but long enough also that, like, I've never lived in a world that didn't have a Disney park, right? Um, so that they've had a lot of time to make an impact.
Now, what's the difference between both parks? Obviously, there's Disney World and Disneyland, but what's the difference between like the exhibits that they show? And does the teaching of the American way or American experience differ between those two parks?
The Disneyland experience was very much shaped by Walt Disney, the individual, and what he wanted to see in his park and really in America in general, right? So it glorifies sort of the American independence, the pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of American frontier feeling, the sort of sense of American optimism that we see in Fantasyland. There is, of course, free enterprise on Main Street, USA, which Walt Disney really benefited from. And then in Tomorrowland, there's the sense of new frontiers, right? And continuing to adventure forward. And all of those things still exist in Walt Disney World. It's got the same sort of basic blueprint as Disneyland. The difference is that they were able to physically expand the park in Florida in ways that they were not in California because they just didn't have the land on which to do it. And so they did add in a section called Liberty Square in Florida that does not exist in California. And it's very heavily based in American history, probably the most heavily based in American history part of a Disney park. It's supposed to represent America on the verge of revolution. And that's where we get the Hall of Presidents, right? Which is, of course, one of the most patriotic experiences one can have at a Disney park.
Now, what does it teach exactly about the presidents? Because I know you go into the Hall of Presidents in your book. Um, but what does it exactly teach about the representation of presidents? And did you ever find it strange that so many presidents have been there, like just to visit the Disney parks in general? Where I was looking it up, I was like, wait, how many of them actually gone? It seemed like everybody just had like that was one thing you had to do as president. You know what I mean? You had to like touch the Liberty Bell and you had to go to a Disney park.
Every president, so since Disneyland opened in 1955, every president except for Lyndon Johnson and Donald Trump has been there at some point in their political lifetime, which is a part of what gives Disney its power, right? They're not, places that presidents go signifies to Americans that it's a place of importance, right, in the American narrative. But it also helps to reinforce the power of the president as an individual. It's kind of like going to a baseball game, right? It's like, look at me, I participate in the American experience just like you guys do. But with like a retinue of security, right? Instead. So it's not, it doesn't surprise me any longer, right? That so many of them have gone. What really did surprise me was how many of them went as soon as it opened. Like they recognized very early on that it was a place that would be important.
Now, when you're teaching about the American experience, though, how do you not fall into choosing a side of it? Like, for instance, if we take the presidents visiting there, I feel like that would be such a risky move as a business because if you have someone that might be a polarizing figure, or might be either whatever political side, the opposite side wouldn't want to go experience it, or they would end up boycotting the park. It would be like if you had McDonald's, if you're a president and had McDonald's, a bunch of people are gonna be like, well, I'm never eating there again because he's the opposite of me, so I want to go eat a Burger King, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's only become sort of a problem for them recently. I mean, every time the president goes, there's going to be people who are always going to criticize whatever any president does, right? But for a long time, Disney has been able to say, we aren't on one side or the other. We are here for the office of the presidency. Um, the Hall of Presidents isn't so much about the individuals as it is, again, the office and its power and sort of why it's important to Americans. But what they have sort of gotten themselves stuck in, I think, is a cycle where uh, they have to be open to every president coming, because as soon as they, for whatever reason or another, right, whether it's political or has nothing to do with politics, as soon as one wants to go and can't go, or as soon as they decide we're no longer putting presidents in the Hall of Presidents, it becomes a political statement, right, whether they intend it to be or not. Um, and so that's an interesting cycle that, I mean, we'll have to see, right? So far in his presidency, Biden has not gone to a Disney park, although he did go as vice president for Barack Obama. Um, so we'll see. We'll see what happens.
How much did you have to learn about Walt Disney himself to be able to understand the parks more to a deeper level?
I think if you understand the parks, you understand Walt, and then vice versa, right? So I did a lot of reading about Walt Disney, and he's fascinating, right? I mean, he's just an incredible historic figure. And I really believe that we wouldn't have the America that we have today if we didn't have Walt Disney, just because of the impact that he has had.
Well, can you maybe describe him or explain him a little bit to me? Because I feel like I don't really understand him, only because I think if you'll come across varying perspectives on him. Um, a lot of people that are really hardcore, like love him to death, and then a lot of people that are very critical of the things that he did through his life, which I just don't know if it's a factor of the times. I mean, if you look at like communism and everything, a lot of billionaires and people that were in high places weren't fans of communism for whatever reason. So for me, it's hard to understand. I just feel like he was someone that eventually got disconnected from the company a little bit, which happens when you get so big. And then I feel like, I don't know, he seemed always very personable. I think if he knew, like, I only learned about the labor strikes and the or union strikes and things of that. I felt like that could have all been fixed if someone would have just gotten in a one-on-one meeting with him and talked to him about it, and he didn't have so much going on, would he be more caring? Because he treated his employees like his family. And I don't see those, and that's kind of like a core American value if you really look at like the old school sense of the American value, where I don't think those fade off. So I wonder if it was just him being so disconnected and so overwhelmed with work that we get this other kind of more critical aspect of him. And you've, diving into the Disney subject, learned about just the separations of views on Walt Disney himself. So it's obviously not easy territory to navigate.
Well, I think ultimately remembering that, he's just a person, right? I mean, he's become this historical figure, and people, like you said, kind of either deify him or uh, devilify him. I don't know what the word for that is, but when I was learning about him, it just seems like you can trace everything that he does to his sense of what he thought was right. And that is because of his background, right? He's born in the early 1900s. He's raised in sort of both a very urban environment in Chicago, but also on a farm in Marceline. And he sort of takes on these very Midwestern, uh, what we often term, sort of looking back, wholesome values. And he also, I think, experienced a lot of luck during his life, right? Which he attributed to being an American, being able to participate in the free market economy, um, being able to work really hard and succeed, which, I think today we look at in a little more, with a little more nuance, right? That not in the United States, it's not necessarily true that everyone just can work really hard and become Walt Disney, right? There are complicating factors to that. And I think that's probably where maybe when we look backwards and criticize Walt Disney, that's maybe what we're seeing. He he was a product of his time. And so he didn't really necessarily understand the nuance that went into his success, or why someone else may not have been able to succeed if they hadn't had the exact same circumstances that he had had. But I think that you're right. He really seemed to treat his company like his family. And only as sort of the company grows, did he sort of become a victim of his own success, right? In that he couldn't any longer treat every individual like they were part of his family. There were just too many people. And that begins to complicate his business relationships, right? And then, as you said, you can go back and listen to your podcast about the strike.
What about Walt Disney and the patriotism? I mean, that was America back then. Everyone was kind of a patriot that was over there. And I think that's why we have such criticism for some of the things that maybe he envisioned today, is because a lot of people, we don't have that patriotism. So when we look at like the American way or American experience through Disneyland, it's probably seen like apple pie America. It's not necessarily the one that everyone kind of hears and goes, all right, well, there's a little bit more, but it's that was the times back then, and that's what he envisioned. I mean, did the parks maintain that, or did they have to change a little bit because of the fact that we're a little bit more aware of other things?
They have changed over time, which I think is a key factor in why they're still relevant, right, and successful today. A great example of that would be a ride that you probably rode when you were 4, and that's Pirates of the Caribbean.
Maybe.
Maybe, yeah, maybe. I know you can take infants on it today, so we'll see. But that's a classic one, right? Everyone knows Pirates of the Caribbean, especially now because of the films. Um, but it's been altered several times over its lifetime to coincide better with sort of where America sees itself. So in general, right, pirates are not the nicest of people, and there was a lot of raping and pillaging, right? That is true, right?
Fact. Yes.
Fact. Disney sort of took that and made it really lighthearted, as they would with all things in their parks. And so initially, there were several scenes in which pirates were chasing townswomen, right, just like around their little house in the town. And in the 70s, 80s, as we get the rise of the feminist movement, people start to go, like the implication here is that when they catch those women, they're probably going to commit sexual violence. And we don't love that, right? Like, if this is a wholesome park, maybe it's not funny that this is the end result of these women. So in the 90s, they just took the turntables and they reversed them. And so now the women are chasing the pirates sort of out of their town, right? And that's okay for a while. And then more recently in the 2000s, there was a scene sort of beloved by Disney fans where pirates were auctioning off several women who were tied together with ropes. Now, the sign said, "Take a wench for a bride." But that's probably not why you're buying a woman at a pirate auction, right? Is to make her your honest bride. And so, again, people were criticizing the company and saying, this doesn't represent the America that I want to live in. This might be true. This might be historically accurate, right? But it's not what I want my children to see when I come to a Disney park. And so they changed that entire scene. And in fact, the famous woman that was being sold, she was known as the redhead because she had red hair and she was very pretty. They've made her into a pirate. So she now has her own agency and she is auctioning off like rum or something like that. So I think, and from what I've read about Walt Disney, I think that he would have been happy with those changes. I think that he was an individual who, when he learned better, was willing to do better. But that's just one of many examples of the park sort of changing over time as America changes over time and understands itself differently.
So Disneyland and Disney World, I mean, just the Disney parks in general, are kind of in a very complex situation here. Because you're not ever going to have both sides happy. There are going to be people that'll criticize you for, I don't want it that real because it's still a kids park, which is kind of the point. If you're a business, I understand. But then also they have an education factor that comes into their parks. not just on their exhibits, but also the impact that they have. I mean, look at the number of people that are homeschooled now using Disney films and using other things as a form that, because they have a moral philosophy in them. A lot of those do, um, which we don't really see that unless we're looking for it, but kids pick it up kind of subconsciously. And as adults, we kind of just analyze it. Oh, it's a film. We get the moral of the story, and we don't really take much from there. But if you really boil down the layers of certain films like Moana and certain films that are especially more newer, they have a lot more messages, and people can have complications with that, and they could also enjoy that. But Disney being an education factor, do you consider them that much, or that they have that responsibility? And do you think they're doing good with it or negative with it?
I mean, working from the outside, I would say I think they do have a responsibility, right? In what they put out, at the very least, that it's not harmful, right? Um, I'm not on the inside of the company, so I don't know if they think that way themselves. Although, in their public relations and in their media, they do seem to, acknowledge again that the things that they do have power and that they have to do them carefully. I think in the end, they're a company just like any other company, and they're going to do what is best for their bottom line. Um, and so, sort of whatever we as the consumer indicate we are happy with is what they're going to go with. Um, and recently, films like Coco and Moana and Canto have been extremely popular and extremely lucrative for the company. And so I think, the votes, if you will, with our wallets are right now saying we enjoy these films that deal with this kind of morality, that have this kind of diversity, that where we can see each other represented. And so I think that's the lesson that we're teaching Disney, whether they already knew it or not.
Was anybody surprised at your work about just the Disneyland parks and kind of them teaching the American experience? Because I don't think a lot of people think about it. I was pretty shocked when I saw it. I was like, all right, you know what? Now that I think about it, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, actually, a lot of my sort of fellow academics at the museum were surprised um, by the impact of the parks, because I think a lot of people who consider themselves scholarly and academic uh, don't want to admit that you can learn from a place that's also made for fun and cotton candy and things like that, right? But I would say that like the Disney parks are just as important as the museum that I work at in teaching American history and understanding um, the American way. And not all academics agree with me or like that I said that, but it is it's I think it's the truth.
Now, can you tell me a little bit about Main Street USA? I was trying to figure out why this was a part of the American experience.
Yeah. So the sort of company line about it is that Walt Disney grew up in Marceline and they had a main street and he thought it was like the most wholesome thing ever, right? And I do think that he had fond memories of Main Street himself growing up. But also, as he's coming of age, and then in the 1950s, there's this nostalgic movement within American culture that sees the American small town, which by that time has largely disappeared, as the pinnacle of American existence. That it was a place where that was small enough that we were all still in community with one another, that people were helping each other out, that the main street was a place where businesses were flourishing and people could participate in that free market economy in whatever way they chose. And that the sort of railways were coming and creating economic opportunities and expansion. And so I think we get it at Disneyland as a combination of Walt Disney's own memories and this movement in the larger culture that says, we should remember this place because it was like the best that we've ever been, right? They called it, the gay 90s, the gay 1890s, the happy time in America. And I think the reality on Main Streets was a little darker. It wasn't quite so happy. Um, and they certainly didn't look like the main street that we see today in the Disney parks. But the main street that we see today in the Disney parks has become our common understanding of what Main Street was. It's replaced the reality. And now, if you think about an American small town, you're much more likely to be picturing something that is based off of Disney's representation of a main street.
Now, how much of the American experience is represented at the parks is the actual American experience, or is it Walt's experience?
That's a very good question. Um, and I would say a lot of what is represented are American values that the majority has held up and said are very important. One of the things that we talked about in the exhibit that we did at the Smithsonian Mirror Mirror was that um, the values don't have sort of a politicization or a color associated with them, right? A value is a value. It's the way in which it's presented that then begins to color it with sort of a bias or a certain point of view. And so, what the Disney parks did was visually present a, a, a story of America that was generally heterosexual and white. But people of all different backgrounds and ethnicities were using the Disney parks as part of their American experience. So one of the things that we did at the museum was ask the public to send us pictures and memories that they had of the Disney parks. And we found a lot of variance in the ethnicities of people that were using the parks, even as far back as the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s, when you might think of it as being very Leave It to Beaver, right? When you're picturing the Disney parks. And so I think the values themselves are American values or were American values, but the way in which they were presented at first was the way Walt Disney viewed the world, because he was an upper class white man and that was his experience, right? And so as now we have more people participating in the creation of the parks who have different experiences, we're seeing different things reflected.
Now, I don't know if it's Main Street USA, but they have different cars or vehicles that go by that change. Um, is that Main Street USA that does
They
that?
do have, yeah, they do have vehicles on Main Street USA. They have like a trolley and a fire engine and a horse-drawn cart.
It's supposed to show the rapid kind of change in technologies that are going forward of that time period. That's really important because if you look at where we're at today, and yes, there's social media platforms and future technologies and things like this that kind of it's the idea of being a creator, but it really doesn't land as much as something like that could really instill into a younger child who would, I mean, does that create the need or the want or the aspiration to want to start thinking about newer technologies? I mean, that was the big thing back when we were trying to land on the moon and really advance forward and move ahead in our way of thinking, being an innovator. We don't see a whole lot of that instilled into us today, unless it's coming from, I mean, the only example I give you is Disney parks.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting way to think about it, in that like the idea of what it means to be a creator has maybe shrunk in America. Um, I think that was one of the values that Walt Disney was trying to showcase. He really believed in continued innovation and new technologies. One of the things that he wanted to do that he wasn't able to do in his lifetime was create what he called an experimental prototype community of tomorrow, which essentially was a city that he would build from the ground up and try to use all the new technologies to see if we could live a better life. Um, he was using the people mover and the monorail and things like that instead of individual cars on the road to get people around. And I think that he would be very happy if the outcome of sort of seeing all these things go by at the Disney parks was someone saying, I could build a better train carriage.
What about this idea of like a utopia, that future city type thinking? That's always been, I think that's like everyone has that type of like weird idea of what it would be like in a perfect world or a perfect society. And I think some parks try and represent it, but also there's always been movies that have tried to make an example or portrayal of a future city or something like that. What do you think that need is? And did Walt obviously have a lot of that in? I mean, he didn't get to live to see Epcot get, finished, but I mean, are they doing a good representation of it now?
Well, after his death, Epcot really changed from his original vision. And they've just recently been redoing it again. Um,
How perfect does this perfect city have to be?
because our idea of perfect's always changing,
That's
right?
right. Yeah.
Right. And like you said, new technologies are always being invented. I think that Walt, you were asking earlier about him as an individual, and one of his characteristics was that he always believed that he could do something better. So the arc of his career is really trying to improve. He tries to improve on animation, and when he feels like he's done everything he could possibly do in animation, he goes to live action films. And then when he feels like I can't make those any better, then he's like, I'm going to build Disneyland, right? He's constantly trying to make things better. So I think Disneyland was his idea of playing at a utopia, in the sense that it wasn't just the future, but it was America as he felt maybe it should have been, right? If Main Street were perfect, if the frontier were perfect, this is what he thought it would or should have been like. And that maybe by showing people that, he could help influence a future utopia, or at least someplace that was a little bit better than the society he was living in the present day.
Do you think that like with the older generations that go there, like grandparents' age and maybe even older parents, they might necessarily not have their kids with them, but for them it's a moment to recapture their childhood. My grandpa loved any Disney thing, like Mickey Mouse was all over like our walls basically growing up. But I heard a story about him. Like he was 16 years old when his dad died and he had to go home and basically raise his whole family by himself. I was like, you didn't have a chance to be a kid, man. And now that I examine why he loved Disney so much, I was like, oh, that was your chance to be a kid again. He was very involved with my nephews before he passed, but I was all about let's go Disney World. They would always go without me though. I was like, are you serious? I haven't been since I was 4 years old. You're not gonna take me back? Maybe I'm just the
That's so
problem.
rude.
I told
That's
my
so
grandmom I didn't need a leash anymore, but she didn't care.
well, now you have to take your nephews, right? You have to be the one, put them on a leash and get them some popcorn. And
They're actually a lot more behaved than I was. I was surprised. It's that newer generation.
yeah, I think though, like we're talking about earlier, probably especially for someone who didn't get to have that part of childhood where you don't have to worry about paying bills and things like that. Um, that getting to have that for just a few hours out of your day is really cathartic.
And you mentioned the feminism movement, but was there any other political movements that had an impact on any of the Disney parks?
Yeah, there's a lot. So the environmental movement, which some people have actually credited Disney, as sort of having a hand in with the film Bambi, um, that it sort of created a generation of children who were like so shocked
Just
that we were out here
scarred.
just yeah so destroyed by the emotional resonance of that film, that they were like, we have to save the earth and all the forests and the deer. um but Disney is known today as sort of a leader in environmentalism, at least in their parks. They have a solar farm in Florida that helps to generate things for their parks. They also in the 80s were, well, even earlier in the 70s and 80s, were impacted by the LGBTQ plus movement. Um, they Now there is like one panel in one Disney park that references a gentleman with his partner. So there is technically, representation of a same-sex couple at a Disney park. But essentially, every movement that impacts American culture in general will have to impact Disney parks, because they are places that represent American culture in general. So if they want to remain relevant, they have to change as we change.
Did you always find it weird that whenever something politically turmoilizing or something that was a lot of turmoil going on in the country at this time, Disney parks always trended too, or they were always in the news about something? where I was like, why does that always pop up in my feed? I just thought maybe like it was just one of those like, hey, you want to take a break from the politics for a minute and, check out a Disney park article? I was like, yeah, that's not too bad. But they kind of go hand in hand, whether it's Trump related stuff or whether it's anything that's really kind of big scenario going on in the United States. There's always a Disney article that I've noticed, at least what I've seen.
I think that that's a testament to how important Disney is in the American experience, right? That so many people, A, will flock to a Disney park in a time of crisis, right? Because they feel like they need that sort of sense of psychological and physical safety. And B, that people are so invested in seeing the change that they hope for, whatever that change is, at a Disney park. It's because they recognize how powerful it is to have a place like that represent you or your point of view. And so I think no matter what side of whatever issue you're on, you're always sort of hoping and looking for the Disney parks to come down to represent you.
Was there any failed attractions you came across that just didn't get implemented or were taken out at any of the parks?
They've changed several attractions over time, uh, but the most sort of famous, I don't know if you want to call it a misstep, but the most famous sort of aborted plan that they had was for a theme park actually was going to be outside of Washington, D.C., called Disney's America. And it was supposedly going to represent the sort of grittier parts of American history. And it ignited this very strong fight back and forth between people who felt Disney could in no way represent American history, um, and people who felt like Disney was the only place that could represent American history.
Did you send the people that say they couldn't represent American history, did you just send them your book like, hey, real quick, just check this out?
Well, this is in the 90s, yeah. So, but there were a bunch of people who come from the same field that I do who argued like, you know, all of us are filtering history through a lens, right? Museums, just because it's a museum and a place that uses research to back itself up, doesn't mean that it's still not being giving you information that's filtered through a lens, right? I'm a human being. The information I'm giving you comes from my experience. Um, and so a lot of people were saying, it's not that much different, right? Disney and museums are not that much different. Now, that didn't land well in the scholarly community at the time. Um, but I think they were spot on. I think in the end, the reason that it ended up not being built wasn't because of that controversy, though. It was because the land that they had identified for it, near Manassas, was near a Civil War battlefield. But it was also near a place where a lot of wealthy ex-politicians and movers and shakers from DC move and retire. And I think that they didn't want
Wasps.
to. Yes,
Wasps.
I think they did not want a Disney park in their backyard. And that's ultimately what killed that project.
Wow, they didn't want a Disneyland park in their backyard. Did you tell them how many presidents go there? Like, come on.
They probably know them personally though, so they don't need them to go to the park.
Uh, Based on working at the Smithsonian, I mean, how do you feel about them representing grittier parts of American history if they were going to do it, and also just representing American history in general? I mean, people might give this Disney World crap or Disneyland, crap for bringing that hardcore, more I guess, realistic American history to people just because they view them as a park. But we don't do that with the Smithsonian. Actually, that's one of the things I've been trying to visit is any of the museums in DC or anything, just because I went down there literally thinking that we were going to go see museums. And I'm 26 years old with like five or six friends, all wanting to go see museums. I should have saw the red flags. We didn't see a single museum. I was very upset. I had like 15 papers printed out of the art gallery and all these things. They're like, we're going to clubs, dude. And I was like,
No, you got to come back, man.
I would have stayed home. And they were like, well, the
We
only
have
way you would have
clubs
went.
here at home. Yeah.
They're like, the only way you would have went is if we told you we were going to museums. I was like, no, we're not going to museums. We're going to clubs, dude. I was like, all right, that's not fair. We're doing a redo on that one.
Yeah, you do. You can go to a club, but the museums are main attraction there.
History's fascinating when you can actually go experience it for yourself, not like on a field trip or anybody's kind of like making you do it. You have to really go and appreciate it yourself.
Yeah, and then you can sort of go to what you're drawn to, right? As opposed to someone telling you what's important.
Point me to the JFK stuff, please. No, but as working for the Smithsonian, I mean, how do you feel about Disney World or Disneyland teaching the American experience compared to how the Smithsonian might teach the experience?
I think that there's room for all of us, right, in teaching the American experience. I think that one of the best parts of a place like Disney is that it can spark that interest in different time periods and different places. I think, for me personally as a kid, I was drawn to Disney, but I was also drawn to, historic homes and places that recreated history because it felt like I could understand the stories of different people a little better. And so for me, if you go to Disney World and you get really interested in cowboys, I think that that's fantastic. I think that's going to bring you then to a place like the Smithsonian or the Library of Congress eventually, where you can learn the history of Black cowboys that you didn't really see at Disney World. But you would never have gotten there in the first place if you didn't have something fun to get you interested in it, right? I don't think anyone studies history initially because they want to learn all the dark parts of it, right? You hear a cool story and that's what gets you interested. And so, yeah, I think that we can peacefully coexist and do our little parts that are different.
Now, your article was really what inspired kind of a lot of the work that you put in for your book, and you couldn't include a lot of what was in the article into your book. What did you leave out that you thought might be important into the book, or maybe one detail you like that you just couldn't put in your book?
Um, hmm. I am interested. I didn't have like the research to back this up, but hopefully in the future I will. I'm really interested in how the Disney parks can use positive experiences to allude to those parts of history that are a little bit stickier. And I'll give you an example that hasn't actually happened yet, but is coming. So uh, at at both parks, they are changing a ride, Splash Mountain, into a new ride, which is called Tiana's Bayou Adventure. And one aspect of that is that it's a cooperative company, is the sort of basis of the ride. That Tiana runs this cooperative company, and that's fun and that's great, right? What's interesting to me about it is that having a cooperative company, if you understand history, implies the need for a cooperative company, implies labor unrest, right? Implies the need for unions and for people to unite. And so I would be really interested to go into, different places, or how in the future the parks could incorporate more of those things that on the surface are perfectly pleasant, right? They're not going to ruin anybody's experience, right? But do allude to that sort of darker history if you are interested enough to go learn about it.
Why is Splash Mountain so controversial? I always saw articles about Splash, I think it's Splash Mountain, that would pop up all the time, and I thought they canceled that ride a long time ago because it had
Well, they
something with it.
canceled the movie
Okay.
that it's based on. So it's based on Song of the South, which came out in the 1940s, and was, in itself controversial at the time. It was boycotted by the NAACP when it came out for the way that it portrayed relationships between Black Americans and white Americans in the immediate post-war, post-Civil War South. It really kind of glorifies the main character who's formerly enslaved. It's sort of implying, right, that now everything is great in his life, when in fact, of course, a sharecropper's existence is not great. You're still sort of under the economic and political thumb of the people who, previously owned your person. So people were objecting to that, and there was also objection to the fact that there are stories within the film animated stories that are based on stories written much earlier by Joel Chandler Harris, who was a white man who wrote stories that he said he heard from Black individuals on plantations. And he wrote them in this sort of very stereotypical pidgin dialect that we would not use today or consider appropriate today. So for all of these reasons, that film sort of, it was popular among certain people. It came out a couple of times, but every time it was sort of controversial. And finally, Disney said, like, we're just not going to release this film anymore because we don't stand behind it in that sense. But in the 90s, they did open Splash Mountain, the ride, which was based on the animated portions of that film. I think they kind of leaned in on the animation, hoping that that would sort of erase some of the racism of the live action parts, but unfortunately, the pidgin dialect still existed. As a ride, it was super fun. It had good music. It was one of the few thrill rides that existed at the park. So people who wanted, like a more exciting experience would go ride it. You would get wet. So when it was hot, people really liked it. It was a beloved ride. And so when they announced that they were changing it, in part because it had simply sort of, it was 20 some years old, it was worn out as a ride. But they also agreed that in part it was because of the sort of racist undertones of the ride. My own sort of theory on why it's so controversial is that it represents sort of where we are in the civil rights movement now, in that a lot of the overtly racist things have been sort of culled from the larger American experience. But that doesn't mean that someone like me, who, would consider myself an ally of all minorities if possible, is not still participating in things that are harmful that I don't understand, right? Or that are so far removed from their roots in racism that it's not clear to me, right, that what I'm participating is painful. And I think understanding that you can participate in something, you can enjoy something, you can think it's harmless, but it still could be hurtful is a hard thing for, particularly for white Americans to come to grips with. To understand that we are still playing a role in the perpetuation of racism, even though we would say, very staunchly that we are not racist. So I think that that's a lot to put on a theme park ride. But I do think that in part that is what is driving some of the controversy is people reflexively saying, but I enjoyed that ride and I'm not racist, right? And trying to figure out how both of those things can exist together.
Well, depending, I mean, if how many rides do they have that involve water at the park? If that's one of, yeah, so if that's one of the major ones, then I mean, people like it for that, but couldn't they just turn it into a Shrek thing where they just had it going like a Shrek style?
Well, Shrek is DreamWorks. Shrek isn't
I thought it
Disney.
was Pixar.
No.
Oh, well, buy Shrek and then just take it out from under them.
It's still gonna be a water ride. So people will still get to have their water thrill rides. So, but they could have done Moana.
Yeah, that's true. But I think their whole thing was because it's in a log, isn't it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the Bayou thing is pretty interesting. I saw you post that on your Twitter, and I was like, actually, that's really cool. I mean, from you going and experiencing the parks, what have you seen as like adjustments that could be made to make it more, I wouldn't say diverse, but a little bit less American imperialist, I guess people would call it. I don't know. When I go to a park, I'm so simple with stuff. I'm always just looking for the rock candy. I don't know why.
And that's fine, right? It's it's
The
it's
Six
having
Flags count
something
because
for
that's where I get rock
everyone.
candy.
Yeah, you can get rock candy at the Disney parks too, though. So next time you go, introduce your nephews to the rock candy.
I
Say
will,
hi.
100%. I
Yeah,
think we tried to go
yeah.
to Hershey Park and then everybody ended up going without me because I had work. And I was like, damn, I was like, I'm never going to be able to get to one of these parks at some point.
Hershey Park is a fun one because I live, not too far from there, so I grew up going there as well.
It's just
Not a big
chocolate.
one.
That's all I
It has a
remember.
lot of chocolate,
Yeah.
not as much rock. Yeah. Um, I think that, they're slowly making their visual culture more diverse. I really think that that's the biggest thing that they can do going forward, to make everyone feel more welcome, particularly in the areas that represent the future. So one of the things that I would say Disney could still do better is that they still have relegated sort of princesses who come from indigenous cultures like Moana, like Pocahontas, to the past, and not represented them as part of America's future in Future World, in Epcot, um, in Hollywood studios, even for instance. And so doing that, integrating that a little bit better, I think would go far. I do think that they're working on it slowly.
Do you think, I mean, obviously their PR team or just their kind of publicity people, they really have to be paying attention to what gets said and take that criticism a little bit. But how much do they rely on academics like yourself and others who go and experience the park and make content about the park? I mean, they obviously have to monitor it for things that get said. I mean, how hard was it for you to make your book? Did they contact you at all? I know you used some photos on there. I'm just wondering if they were interested in how they're being represented, and also do they respect a lot of the comments that are being made, like, hey, you could do this or you could do this, or why did I have to wait 90 minutes for this particular ride that's kind of awful?
Yeah. They did not contact me about the book. You know, I try to sort of not, you don't want to involve the company too much in what you're doing, because of course you both want to be able to say, it's independent, right? It's not influenced, um, by what the company might want you to say in the end. But I have, spoken with individuals who have read my book and also work for the company and were largely pleased, with the things that I had to say, and know that there are changes that need to be made and or could be made. But that, like every other place, including the museum that I work at, um, change is subject to funding, change is subject to time, and so I don't know that they're like looking at my book or looking at the things that I have to say and being like, oh yeah, she's on the money, right? Like we should do the things that she said. Um, but I also think that, if I'm noticing it, they're probably noticing it as well. Um, just because I'm looking at the same sources that they are, right? I'm monitoring what the fan sites are saying and what people are saying on the internet and things like that. And I'm sure they are as well.
This is a couple areas of just my own interest, but did you know that they really have treated people with special needs in like a really good way? And I'm like, like I said, that's one of the things I mark in their very pro positive category for me. But I'm always coming across a video of just like, even with the actors, the people that are in the suits and everything. Me personally, I wouldn't let my kids near somebody in a suit. It's just a thing with me. I just get freaked out about that. But they've done really well, and talked to a lot of friends who have special needs kids and love bringing their kids there specifically because of the environment is so good for them. And I mean, what are your thoughts on either with special needs? And also, there's a video you can watch on YouTube. It's like 1,000 people being passed as citizens or inaugurated as citizens. That's so crazy. And that's like when you hear criticism about Disney World and all that, I'm like, hold on a second. Look at the things they do. Like that's a park doesn't need to do that. A park could just like slap a wristband on you, collect however much money you're paying for, and then you're off to the show. But they've actually gone above and beyond to really kind of exemplify that welcome to, this is America. You're stepping inside of a piece of America.
Yeah. No, I think that you're absolutely right. And I think that the way in which they treat people is, again, indicative of, for a lot of people who come from outside of the country, Disney might be their only experience with America, right? It's a worldwide destination. And so it is indicative to them of what America is and what America means. And when we did all of these interviews with the public and asked them for their stories, we heard a lot of families, like you said, who had young children, had children who had special needs, who said that it's the one place where they can take their children and they know that they're safe, right? That if, a child who tends to run away runs away, that they can't go anywhere where they're going to get hurt, that they know psychologically that their kids are safe. And, you know, as a parent myself, that's invaluable, right? Um, and I think that that goes back to Walt Disney, like you said, and in the fact that he wanted everyone to feel like they were part of his family or America's family. And he really started that tradition of we treat every guest here, you know, like they are the most important guest that comes into the park. Um, you know, you can trace that back to it's still not talked about in academia a lot, and I'm not sure why, but you know, in the 1950s, a lot of places in America were still segregated uh, based on color, and Disneyland was never segregated. So as long as you could buy a ticket, you know, you could come in and do your thing in the park. Um, and I think that that goes back to Walt Disney saying everyone who comes here is my guest, is the guest, and they're welcome and they're important. And that is part of the Disney magic that if Disney can hold on to it, will keep them successful, I think.
I honestly just got two final questions for you, but they're about kind of the same thing. It's back to the presidents. Uh, One, Lyndon Johnson not going there. That's a shocker to me. I don't know if there's a story behind that.
He he was kind of just a cantankerous individual, so he wouldn't have gone for like fun. But also Walt Disney was notoriously a Goldwater guy, and he was not an LBJ supporter. So I think that that probably influenced it as well.
That's funny. That's funny. Barry Goldwater.
Yep.
Nixon. I got
Yeah.
to hear about Nixon's experience at Disney World. I know
He,
you listen to the Nixon tapes. That's
yeah.
why I want to ask this one specifically. They're fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy. And it was crazy how many times, I think it was over 40 times that Disney was mentioned in the Nixon tapes. Um, Nixon loved it. He continued to go, you know, after he was out of office, when he was older. And he once told, I mean, this was like in the 80s, right? He was taking his grandkids, I think, to Disney World. And he told a reporter, you know, I've been all around the world and you haven't seen the world until you've seen Disney World, right? And I don't know, maybe that traces back to the idea that even the most, you know, important people in the world need a space where they can forget about things for a while. It is an interesting contrast to the picture I think that we have of Nixon when you think of him in your head, and he's this very like straight-laced, you know, individual. And then you see a picture of him on the teacups, and it's very humanizing, I think.
Well, Nixon, out of probably a lot of presidents, really had the hardcore extremist view of American value in his head, especially with like the whole counterculture movement going on around the time of his presidency. And really, I mean, like, I don't think his ban on drugs and all that was bad at all. I just think it was a little bit misunderstood, especially for how much we know medication wise it can help out for a lot of people as well too. But it was just interesting when I heard you mention, I think it was in an interview you mentioned about the Nixon tapes. I was like, no way. I was like, tell me, those things are fast. I had Luke Nitcher who studied them on my show about it. And I realized, no, the taping system was in there for a while, but the Nixon one is the one we have just you couldn't go through it all. There's no way. There's so many hours of it where I'm like, man, do you find it weird that he says like just weird things when he speaks? Like he's always like, like, our erect policies or astute person. I was like, why are you using those words? Just talk normal.
Now it was hilarious, and God bless all the archivists who listened to them and transcribed them so you could search them, because yeah, that's a monumental task.
Yeah, I don't even think I can listen back to all my content, to be honest with you. Bethany, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show about this. Is there a place where people can find any of the links you'd like to promote, where they can find your books? If you have you have a Twitter. I'm going to link that in the description. But any other links you have out there?
Yeah, I am on Twitter as at BB Celestio, and then I am on Instagram as Bethanee Bemis.
Okay. Well, I'll make sure I link all those links in the description. Again, it was a pleasure chatting with you, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of Blank. Stay tuned for next episode.